Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and today we're excited to talk about part 4, the last part, in our MEP Productivity Pack Project Startup Workflow webinar series. As always, of course, these webinars are recorded, and we encourage you to go check them out on our YouTube channel. Would also be great if you subscribed over there on the YouTube channel, because that way you can be notified when new stuff goes live. These MEP Productivity Pack videos are going to our YouTube playlist for this Project Startup series. Also, of course, if you have questions while we're going through today's webinar, we encourage you to throw them into the questions window. I try to keep an eye on them while we're covering today's topics or each webinar's topics when we're talking about it live, and you can get your questions answered immediately, usually, and or answered at the end in our large QA session that we reserve in case you have a bunch of questions that don't fit well directly within the main webinar itself. So with that, let's jump into today's topic. Well, the MEP Productivity Pack really is a powerful collection of workflows. I mean, it's great content, it's great workflows, it's a powerful template. And here's the trick, you got to be able to implement these workflows in the most efficient and most consistent way so that you can realize all the benefits of what this template and productivity pack is designed to do. Model startup tasks, when you do this right, really can save you hours and hours of project startup time. We've already talked about a number of aspects of this project startup that we can automate down to minutes instead of days or weeks of project startup. In this part 4, we're talking about how you can, as efficiently as possible, generate spaces, zones, and basically prepare for the full MEP design experience beyond this project startup. And so we're going to be digging in deep to a couple of very specific topics. I've actually added a 5th bullet point today because we're going to talk a little bit about stuff that you can do after this. And I want to show you a couple of tools that you could leverage as your next steps. So first off, you can rapidly generate and name all of your required spaces based on the architect's model. This is actually a pretty quick process. It's native to Revit. I'm not doing anything that requires any special add-ins. 100% native Revit. We're just going through the workflow so you have a solid idea of kind of what's going to happen there. And also some things that the MEP Productivity Pack's template has already in place so you don't have to worry about manually setting some of these things up. We're going to talk about zone creation and the validation of some of the space and zone association, making sure that you understand some of the view templates that we've got associated in the MEP Productivity Pack so you can know exactly how to leverage these views for the most optimal workflow. We're also going to talk about a couple of different ways you can establish some preliminary heating and cooling loads, both inside Revit natively and also externally, though I won't live go through the external example, I'll talk about it. We'll kind of see how you could potentially do some external heating and cooling loads. We'll talk about automating some of the outdoor airflow calculations from the ASHRAE Table 62.1 type calculations. There's technically 2 ways of doing it, and we're going to talk about one that's live using native Revit, but also there's a potential of leveraging some schedules that we've provided if you want a different workflow. I'm going to point you to the documentation for that. And then finally, we're going to go over some workflow overview, just kind of talking about the design aspect after this setup has been done. And also, as in each of these sessions, we're going to talk about where we are in this project startup workflow. So, we've got a number of steps here: opening detach, saving as, reloading links, copying, monitoring, creating plan views and putting them on sheets, typical schedules and preliminary details for the type of project that we're working on. And all of that stuff is stuff we've already covered in previous sessions, parts 1, 2, and 3. Today's session, we're talking in depth about creating spaces, zones, and doing a little bit of preliminary analysis. And we're also going to talk very lightly about the beginning of the design process, though that really kind of falls on you. I'm just going to point you to a few views as to what you can leverage there in our pre-set up view templates for kind of designing and beginning that process. First, though, for today, let's jump in and start talking about the ways in which we can generate spaces. There's a couple of key things that I find a lot of people forget about when dealing with spaces, and we're going to talk about a few aspects of this so that you can have kind of a really good starting point on how to create spaces. Though again, this is all core Revit. We're just talking about some best practices here. So when we're talking about creating spaces in the Revit environment, where we typically will go is the Analyze tab within Revit, the Spaces and Zones grouping, and using the Space command. And we're going to be using that today live. Also, as a part of this, there's a follow-up piece that actually leverages space naming from that same Spaces and Zones, and we'll be doing that in a future step. Before we do the space naming, though, one of the things that I like to do is delete the unnecessary spaces, because I'm going to be using a place automatically option for each of my levels to save me a bunch of time. And when you do that step, you end up getting a lot of extra spaces that aren't necessarily valid, and we need to find a way to quickly delete them. I'm going to be building a temporary schedule in Revit to help me do this and show you some techniques that I leverage to very quickly strip out the junk, the stuff that's not really needed. And again, for that, I use a temporary schedule. Now, there's also a step inside of here where you may need to subdivide out spaces. There's plenty of times when the architect's design calls for, say, a corridor, but that one corridor might span quite a long distance, and maybe I want to subdivide that up, or maybe they didn't use room definitions, room delineations quite as well as perhaps they could or should, and because of that, I may need to do my own work there, and so I can subdivide spaces after I've automatically created them. We'll take a look at a couple of examples of that. We're also going to take a look at some quick tagging and naming of these spaces. This is where I'm going to use that space naming utility at this point, and I tend to do this after I've done some subdividing of spaces, just because this way I can actually automate the naming and space numbering properties at this point, even after I've created some of my own manual spaces on top of the automatic placement. And then we're also going to talk about some space settings, specifically space type, and if we're focusing on electrical also, it's going to be target illumination. I know a lot of the time the electrical team and sometimes the plumbing teams, they tend to maybe not use spaces. I find that to be potentially a detriment, actually. I like using spaces. They're a powerful tool that gives me a lot more power if it's just for placing the tags where I want them to go and not relying on the position of the architect's tags, but also for some of the analysis inside of here that you can run after the fact. So we're going to be talking about all of this. And again, we'll be doing this live inside the Revit environment. So I'm going to jump over into our project. And of course, I just opened this up a minute ago here, and I'm on the cover view where I typically will land, so I can see things like, in my case, I've placed the model health information here just to kind of see the general overall health of my project. I don't think I have anything set up inside of this one for spaces right now. No, I don't. I have a whole bunch of text types. I probably should purge some of those out. I've got way more than I need. But I don't have any actual spaces or elements, not a lot of instances placed here in my model other than just a couple of items so far. So what I'm going to be doing is jumping over into the load calculations area right here. In load calculations specifically, I'm going to collapse model setup because we're kind of done with that step for now. So I'm just going to collapse this down. I'm looking here for the HVAC zone diagrams. This focuses mostly on HVAC zones, but these views are also very useful if you're doing this on the electrical or plumbing front as well. I'm going to start here on level 1, just opening up this floor plan view and taking a look at what we have. So out here in this floor plan, I already have the HVAC zone legend because this particular view pre-existed in my model, and this particular legend was already out there. So when I reloaded the architect's background and set all my information up here and got my scope box all configured for my building, it actually automatically updated this particular view. There was no work for me to do at all. It's already all set up. And the view template here is already queued for everything that I'm about to do here with spaces. The roof plan technically is also set up, even though I probably don't need a roof plan for HVAC zones. Maybe there's some rooms up on the roof that I might care about that I might need to worry about. But the rest of these floor plans, there's an action that I'm actually going to take to be able to place this zone legend. So I get the proper legend and actually graphically represented in those other floor plans. I'll show you how I do that. So here, first though, on level 1, let's just go through the exercise of actually placing a space. And again, the way that we do this is we go to the Analyze tab, we go to the Spaces and Zones grouping right here, and we're going to be placing spaces. So there's the space command. When you click on this, you have the ability now to interactively begin placing spaces. And the mistake that I see a lot of people make is they just start placing spaces out here, or blindly they just click the place spaces automatically and they don't take a look at any of the other settings. These other settings are really important. In the case of this particular building, the vast majority of my rooms are open to the deck above. And so I'm going to start by giving myself a little bit of a head start by paying attention to this little options bar right here. My upper limit for this level, since I'm on level 1, I'm actually going to set to the level above, which is level 2. Sadly, there isn't a level above default, so I have to keep changing this every time I switch to a different floor plan. I'll be focusing on making sure I set my upper limit. I am going to set my offset as well. I want that to be set 0 to the level above if I have the open to deck condition above it. And now, instead of placing individual spaces one by one, I can simply use the Place Spaces Automatically button here. Before you do this, one of the things you can also do, by the way, is check your boundary highlighting. If you highlight your boundaries out here, it will show you everything that is going to be a boundary or can be a boundary for your spaces. Now, by default, if you just manually inserted an architectural model inside, oh, look at that, there's actually a space floating out on the side here that I forgot to delete. That's fantastic. I may have to delete that later. If you have an architectural model that you manually inserted, it may or may not have all the right settings. I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to hit Escape here. I'm going to select this architectural model so you can see some of those settings that we'll be talking about here. This thing happens to be pinned in place right now, so that's one of the settings, the fact that it's pinned. It's already inserted origin to origin, which is fantastic. And in the type definition of this particular link, it's already set to be room bounding. The architectural shell model, the AS model, also is set in the exact same fashion. This also is set already on a work set for this type definition, and it's matching the work set for the instance over here. All of this is already preset so that you don't have to worry about any of this at all when you first go in here for this spaces sort of dropping in of your space elements. Now, when you go in to drop in your space elements, you may want to just double check and make sure you're on a good work set for this. In this case, my spaces I tend to put on the shared levels and grids kind of work set here because it goes beyond just mechanical HVAC, right? This affects all of the disciplines. It's useful across the board. So I'm just going to stay here on shared levels and grids for right now at this point. That was my default. That's where I had it set this whole time. That was where my template has it set, because during the startup phase, then I don't have to really think about work sets at all until I actually get into the design aspect of this. So let me go back to space. Now notice every time I click the space command, it defaults back to the active level I'm on with a default offset of 8. It always does that. Kind of frustrating for me. 8 feet in this case in the US, and it's probably 2 meters, I would bet, in the metric aspect of it. But I'm going to set this to 0 offset from my level above, which is level 2. Again, I've already highlighted my boundaries. I saw that the entire model was room bounding. If I wanted to, I could inspect, area by area if I really wanted to, but I'm just going to click here quickly and place these spaces automatically. So it'll drop in 75 spaces. A lot of these are unnecessary, and we're going to take a look at that next, actually. We're going to go and delete unnecessary spaces from this model. Now, before I do that, I'm actually going to do one more level here. We're going to do this same exact step. I guess I'll do it here on level 2. Might be a good example. Now, on level 2, when I open up this view, you'll notice it's missing that zone diagram. So you could place that by simply going to, I believe it's Annotate, and we're going to place in a color fill legend here. And all I have to do is just place that in the view, because the view already knows which color fill legend it wants to be using. It knows, because of the view template, that it's colorizing based on the HVAC zones. That's already set. The view template controls that. You don't have to worry about it. What I like to do is place the graphical zone legend out here. Now, if you want that placed in the same place in every single view, you could also do a copy-paste operation where you select it, you Control-C, you go to the next view, and you paste aligned to the current view, or you paste aligned to all views. You might pick those views. So it's pasted in the exact same physical location across all the views. That's something that I might do, but usually I just find myself going view to view and simply using the annotate command, the color fill legend, and dropping it wherever it's convenient in my model, typically in my case, someplace to the upper right. Personal preference. By default, though, there aren't any zones defined inside of here, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's actually a next step kind of thing. I just wanted to point out that the zone diagram doesn't exist in other views that you created via the view creator workflow we did earlier. It creates the properties, but doesn't actually place any annotation. This is an annotation element into the view. So that's one step that you take manually for any views you don't already have existing in your model. So on this level, though, I'm going to go through the exact same process one more time. I'm going to go ahead and go to Analyze, Spaces, same thing, double check my level here. It's going to be the level above, which is level 3 with a 0 offset. Almost all of this is open to above. There's a few offices that have some enclosed ceilings. I could modify those individually if I wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and just say place spaces automatically, and it's going to drop all these spaces in here. So 85 spaces created. Now this large space here certainly is almost certainly going to be one where I'm going to want to subdivide it, right? I'm going to want to create individual heating and cooling zones. This wall over here is going to probably get different heating properties than this wall over here, even though it's an all open shared space. So just for some zonal controls, I might do that. Also, if I go down to my level 1, there's some scenarios here where I have sort of this area where there's an open office, but then there's kind of a corridor that's all kind of lumped in together here. It's an open space. And so what I might do is want to place my own space down here. And this is where we get into that subdividing of spaces. To subdivide a space, I've placed, actually, I need to do one thing first because I didn't do this step yet, and that's the deleting of the unnecessary spaces. Let's get that step done. You might notice that inside of these little pilaster areas inside of here, there's a lot of spaces placed inside of these little sort of just dead zones, right? There's some space placed right here. Again, a dead zone. There's a space placed over here. These are just unnecessary spaces. Now, I could certainly go through and one by one find and delete these things, but I find that to be really inefficient. So what I do, since there isn't a default schedule built in for this, is I quickly make myself a schedule. So I'm going to go here to Schedules and Quantities. From here, I'm going to be making a space schedule. Doesn't really matter what it's named. Space schedule 2 is fine because there was already one made at one point before this. And I like to include the area of the space, so AR. And I also like to include the level of the space, since I can now find out what levels things happen to be on. In fact, I'll probably put that first. And then I also like to include from the room area here, since I haven't done any space numbering or naming yet, I'm going to go to the room and include the room number. See, if it's not associated to an architectural room number, it's probably not something that I need. So what I like to do then is I like to, I'm not going to do any filtration here. I'm just going to sort and group. I'm going to sort first by level, then by the room number, and then by the area. So that easy. So I've included 3 fields, level, room number, area, and I'm also then sorting by level, room number, area. That's pretty much it. Now you could have this by default in your template if you really wanted to, or not. So now what I can do is I can see that my level 1 stuff right here has a bunch of rooms that are a bunch of spaces rather that don't have associated room numbers. And if I was to scroll down below, I can see also on level 2 the same thing. And so I've done this by level first just so I can isolate it and go kind of view by view and do some of this quick management. So what I'll do is I'll just highlight real quick here a bunch of these levels in this a bunch of these spaces from level 1 that don't have an associated room number. I'll click over to that zone diagram level 1 over here, and we'll see them all highlight. So they're all highlighted red out here. Now with this, some of these are ones that I actually want to keep, or maybe the architect just hadn't placed a room because they didn't care to. Good example of that is closets. They don't necessarily always place rooms in closets, though I may want to account for the volume of that air. That might be something that I care about, so I can deselect these areas. There's this one right here where they didn't place a room in this sort of restroom vestibule area, so I could deselect these as well. I'm not going to be deleting those ones. There's this entry space over here that was never got a room, I guess, whatever. There's 2 closet spaces up here. I'm just kind of quickly scanning the floor plan for anything that might be an accessible space, but that doesn't actually, or that doesn't have a room associated. So the rest of this stuff out here, all these other little spaces, they're all junk. I don't need them. I'm not going to really analyze them. It's just dead space. I probably don't care about them at all. So I can take all of these and simply hit delete. In fact, there's one out here as well, apparently, out in this sort of garden area. For whatever reason, there's a space sitting out there. I didn't realize that was even there. So I'm just going to delete these. So they're gone now from my model. Now, what that does in the schedule is it groups all of them together. Now they're not placed on any level. They're just not placed. And so all these not placed spaces, these can all be deleted. They're just not necessary in my model. They're just taking up database space that aren't doing anything for me. I can delete those for real. I would repeat that process for level 2, finding all the spaces that really are unnecessary. Some of these are probably maybe real, like closet spaces, again, 56 and 41 square feet. Some of these maybe just aren't necessary at all. So to do this one more time, highlight level 2, jump to the zone 2 diagram, see all of what they are. Looks like just a lot of dead vestibule space. One closet right here. There's a tech closet there, one over here in the hallway. Looks like that's pretty much it. So there's only 2 on this level that I really cared about, and the rest of this was just junk spaces that aren't really necessary. So I can delete those. And then once again, when I jump back to that schedule over here, it groups in this whole not placed area, and all of these spaces can be deleted. Delete the row. They're gone. All right. Now, at this point, all the spaces that I have are all good. They're all things that I want to continue to use, and I want to organize, and I want to zone out and work with them. But before I do that, I want to do a little bit of subdividing, because again, this space right here is kind of silly where it's got the one space above and then a different space down here. Probably control this in a different way. Maybe this corridor out here I might control in a different way as well. So to do some subdividing of spaces, it's pretty straightforward. It's going to be going over here to the Analyze tab just like before. And you've got a special line here called a space separator, where you can do your own subdividing to cut out areas where you want your own delineation to be able to subzone something. Just going to draw these space separators across. As long as it cuts the space, that's the important part. Down here, perhaps I'm going to cut the space maybe across here. Maybe I might go to 45. It's up to you how you want to cut that. Similarly here, maybe this one up here. I don't know where I'm going to cut this. Maybe I'll cut it right through here. Maybe this will be its own little space up in this area. So I've got one sort of rear corridor. I need to place some replacement spaces here with the same rules as before, right? So up to level 2, and then drop in my spaces out here to fill in these areas where I created some divisions. And that's it. That's me creating some subdivided spaces for my own purposes. Now I want to just label all of these so I can see everything that's going on. I want to see all the names that show up out here. So I'm going to use just a common annotate tag command here. Since it did not tag automatically when I placed it, I'm going to be tagging all of my spaces now, just using the tag all command, going in here and basically view by view. That's how I like to do it. Objects in my current view. I'm going to go in here and use a space tag. Now, for whatever reason, I don't have a space tag loaded. And I also didn't happen to open up Hive before our discussion today because I have a beta build installed right now, so I couldn't use it anyway for this. So what I'm going to do is use a traditional load method to load in a tag real quick. Insert, load family. There's a zone tag. I'll load that one in since I'll want that one anyway. And I may as well then also load in the space tag, which is one level above. Looks like I was testing this out earlier because I'm in the right directory already. In my case, I'm in an MEP subdirectory here for the 20.1.1, the version that I'm working on here. But the data structure is very much the same for all of the 20 point whatever builds. So here in this case, space tag, load this in, overwrite my existing values. Shouldn't be editable because it wasn't existing before. Well, that's fine. We'll replace it anyway. And now I should be able to do annotate, tag all, and space tags should be here. Yes, here we go. So With the space tags or any tags, when you're using the tag all option, a powerful setting that you have here is the ability to drop down this list and choose which tags specifically you want to be placing. Now, by default, the space tag that I like to place is using the space name and number. Now, if you happen to be doing this for electrical and maybe you won't be doing maintaining any renaming of your own spaces, you could just use the room name and number itself, or the room number by itself, or the name, number, and volume, or whatever you want. Or you can do the space name and space number and airflow and areas and other properties here. So there's a number of options that you have. I like using the space name and number because that way, if I choose to override the name of a subspace for whatever reason, I have that ability. Especially since I've created my own spaces here, 3 extras in this particular level, I want to be able to name them and then potentially modify their names to kind of deviate a bit from the original architect's room name for my own purposes. So go ahead and use that default one there, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, which will drop in all of my spaces. And these all, by default, have just space and a number, right? Because I haven't run the naming utility yet. So now it's time for me to do my final step before I really move on to kind of associating some of the properties of these spaces, and that is get these to all be named correctly. Back here on Analyze, there's a baked-in function now in modern versions of Revit called space naming. You simply click that. It's going to ask you how you want to name it. I'm going to be telling it to apply names and numbers either to all levels for all 83 place spaces, or I could do just a specific level. If I wanted to really go level by level, I could do that. In my case, though, I tend to just be lazy and do names and numbers for all levels and call it good. In the future, when I get updates from architects, after I may have gone through and overridden names myself, I may choose to synchronize the numbers only, just the numbers, and then whatever space names I've overridden, they get maintained, unless the architect's done a major redesign. Then I might just delete it and start over. And then I'm doing names and numbers again. But that really depends. At first, though, it's names and numbers for sure. Go ahead and hit OK here. Takes all of a few seconds, runs and just does that whole naming process, uses exactly the architect's names and numbers. In this case, it looks like the architect screwed up and has 3 rooms that are all the same room number, which is not ideal. But that's on them. So I'm just going to leave it whatever they've got. I'll leave it that way. And I'll click OK here. So a nice, very nice feature here of the naming process is that when it recognizes that I've placed multiple spaces in the same room area, it automatically suffixes it with, in this case, -1. That's the original one. And then the second one that I placed is -2, and then the next one's -3, and it also has aligned the naming convention of this corridor 1, 2, 3 as well. And then similarly over here in my sales area, sales 1, 24-1, and sales 2, which I'll probably be renaming this to like lobby or something so that it has its own name, right? I can do whatever I want here. It's up to me. Maybe I want to call it out by a zone name. It's whatever. I control this now. And so I can deviate from whatever the architect may or may not have done. Now, any place where the architect did not provide a name, it just left it alone. It's still, 038, the original name, the original space name. So that's just going to be whatever. Like in the case of the closet here in this sort of restroom vestibule area, that also just has the default space names because the architect never placed rooms. In the future, maybe I refresh that. We'll see what happens. So now it comes time for me to start working on kind of assigning some properties to these spaces. I like to do this before I start doing my zone association personally, but you can do this in pretty much whatever order from this point forward. But I'm going to go ahead and select this particular space and point out some properties that exist over here. There is a property that is called space type. Let me find out where this is. Right here, underneath energy analysis, there's a property here called space type. And then right now, it's just using the default building definition. Now, the building overall, in my case, this model, and by default, all of the models that are started from the template, unless you change it, will be set to an office type building. You can modify those from the, I believe it's Analyze over here, and there's, where is it at? I forget exactly where that setting is. Not a big deal, I guess. We can come back to that later. I can also find it through here. But in the definition of the building, there is space types and building types. And in this case, by default, every space you place just leverages the default of the building. Now, I like to subdivide these. So since all of these are enclosed offices, and I know that happens to be an actual space type, I can select all of these particular offices here. And technically, for that matter, there's a few other kind of spaces up here that are enclosed offices. There is an office over here that is an enclosed office. Let's see, there's one down here, also an enclosed office. So I can select all of these little enclosed office areas, and for each of them, tell it that I only want to be working with spaces, since I happen to window select some space tags as well. But for all of these, I want them to be set up as a specific type of space. And this will set some specific properties inside of here that we'll use later in some of our analysis. In this case, if I just go to the top here and filter for office, I can tell it this is an enclosed office, which has some properties. Now, you can certainly pre-tweak these properties if you want them to align with whatever code standards are in your area. Absolutely go through, tweak them, and perhaps if you modify them for a specific code or you have multiple variant codes for enclosed offices in different regions, maybe name them accordingly as well. I would probably go through and create these space type settings in my template or in the sample building model, so when I cut a new template, they're already there. But have these kind of pre-tuned so that your team, when you're actually designing, they're not needing to go through and manually tweak each one of these. Maybe just do a visual validation. Though if there was a special case where I wanted to intentionally, go in and have 0.5 air changes per hour or whatever on this particular enclosed office, I could modify it accordingly so that it actually updates when it assigns to all these spaces what that air changes per hour is, and that'll kind of affect some of those airflow calculations. Whatever else, all these other settings inside of here, of course, you're going to want to make sure that you adjust these. I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK here. Also inside of here, up a little bit higher, there is a target illumination setting inside of here. If you're doing lighting analysis, this might be a property that you care about in this area here. So in this case, I'm going to set this to an office setting for these target illumination, so each one of these has some special design criteria associated to it above and beyond just the space type. So these are two different settings that you can leverage. And again, if you're electrical laying out spaces, you can leverage these on spaces where you can't leverage these on just rooms that sit in the background model. So both of these properties are ones that you're probably going to want to set. Maybe I go through and grab, for example, the support space over here, which is sort of an open office configuration, as is these few areas over here. This little spot back here, right? There's I can't select it real easy right now. Just grab this guy, right? These are all sort of open to air office type environments. I can go ahead and once again set the space type here to office, but this time it's going to be an open plan style office, slightly different properties. Perhaps I should probably adjust that as well, but I'll leave it alone for right now. And then the target illumination, once again, this happens to be an office, and I want to set it up as such so that its illumination, isn't diminished just because it's an open plan. So any of the rooms out here that you need to associate, go ahead and do that. I like to do that earlier on. Now, one of the things you can do while you're kind of validating your association is jump into your schedules over here. There's a companion schedule that you can use for this. It's probably the first time we're going to actually leverage schedules that are built into the MEP productivity pack during this project startup process here. Underneath HVAC, there's a load calculations collection of schedules here. And one of them is the space airflow summary, and the space load summary is the one that I'm actually focusing on here, and space type assignments. Looking at these, they kind of help you go through and validate, did I associate a property or not, right? These settings here are all expected by you to go through and fill out what these values are. You can see I've done a few of them, but there's a bunch of others that I need to go through and update as well. Similarly here, there's the space load summary over here, which will let me once again see that space type association. So you can go through, again, make these associations, see what the design parameters are, the estimated number of people in these spaces, the heat gain properties, all of this based on those settings. So you can visually validate this information based on what you set up here in these different space types. Okay. Now I don't like modifying them from here because from here it tends to be one at a time. Whereas in the floor plan, I can window select a bunch of items and make the changes kind of in bulk. But certainly here is another great place if you wanted to tweak one or two of these values where you can go in and begin to modify them. So one of the things you may also choose to do here is change your sorting up a little bit. You might want to understand what level these are on. So you might want to add levels and some groupings for that. That's all up to you. This is just a starting point, just some quick load calcs so you can kind of see what's going on here. Okay, the next schedule that we're going to be digging into here is actually this HVAC zone summary, but we don't have any zones yet. Our next major step is actually to create and associate some zones to these spaces that we've just placed. So what does this process look like? You're going to go to Analyze again. A lot of our work today is going to be on Analyze. Analyze spaces and zones, same place we were for spaces, but now instead of making spaces, now we're making zones. For the zones, you can either create a new zone and then associate spaces to it, or you can select the spaces first and then create a zone and it automatically builds that association. And then I like to tag and name my zones in some kind of consistent way. And that way I can identify them and the views that we'll be working in will actually help us identify them as well because of the color filling that we've got pre-baked inside of there. So back in our Revit model, I'm going to jump over here to my zone diagram for level 1, and I'm just going to make a couple of zones inside of here, just a few. We're not going to go nuts today. I'm going to start by selecting just these spaces right here, jumping up to the Analyze tab and creating a zone. If I pre-select and click zone, it automatically builds it. I don't have any extra real work to do. It just makes it. Now, when it makes that zone, it calls it out based on whatever the previous zone was that was made. So in my case, VAV2-09 was probably the first one, and now it's calling it out as HVAC2-10. So I'm just going to quickly renumber this because I like having all my level 1 VAV zones in this case, since this is a VAV supplied building, be 1- and then whatever number, 1-1 in this case. So we'll start there. Now what this will do as I begin associating spaces to zones, this color fill legend will auto-assign colors. And it makes it really easy for me to go see, do I have just a basic mint out there, or do I have actual zone colors going on? Did I miss anything in the floor plan for actually associating to zones? Those zones are very nice for some of the clustering and grouping when I get it to external analytical programs, but also just for making sure that my general system zones are properly organized here, just visually, and also in the system browser inside of the MEP working environment for Revit. So I'm going to create another zone right here. Same thing. Select the zone first, Analyze, Zone. So it's going to make the next one 1-2, gives it its own unique color. Again, it's automatically colorizing this. Now, if you just click the Zone command with nothing selected in Revit, it's going to start the Edit Zone command, and you can start to pick spaces to add to it. You can also edit the name prior to its original creation here, and then I can actually finish editing that zone, and it'll, again, assign it a unique color. So you can work either way. Select first, and then navigate to Analyze Zone, or click Zone, and then have to pick individual spaces to add to that. So I could select this, Analyze Zone. The only annoyance there is that I have to keep navigating back to Analyze Zone because Revit likes to move where my focus based on whatever it is I've selected. Okay, so that's the whole process for creating the zones themselves. Now, I like to tag them as well. So I see the colors, I can do a color matchup out here, but as I get more and more and more zones, sometimes it's easier just to have the zone tagging just right there on the floor plan. And that's something that can absolutely be tagged. I can go through and after I've made a bunch of zones, do a quick tag all command, tag all zones using whichever zone tag variant it is you want, whether it be calculated loads, cooling, heating loads, or just the name and number or name of that particular zone, whichever one is appropriate for your current workflow. I'm just going to go ahead and use the default here of the calculated loads and click OK. Nothing's been computed yet because, well, I haven't run any analysis. It kind of helps me validate that. And so I'm just going to take this zone right from the middle. If you mouse over the centroid of the tag and you drag it off to the side, you can actually get these to pull outside the room. Still has the space associated, but it actually pulls the tag off to the side and the zone kind of origin point goes off to the side as well. This just helps me so that in the future when I rerun a tag all, I didn't move the tag off the centroid of the zone, so it won't ever get re-tagged, something that I see happen periodically. So I just like to drag these out just to kind of create some definition, some break here. In this case, it looks like the zone's up here on top instead of being in the centroid of the actual tag itself. So I'm going to pull this up to the top, leave that tag right where it is, and it's now showing me the tag for the associated zone. If you wanted to in your visibility graphics, you can also turn on the zone, what's it called? The zone, I think it's lines is what it is. That would be in the view template down here. You could turn that on so you can actually see all of these lines pointing back to the actual origin or centroid of each of the spaces that are in the zone itself. So that sometimes is helpful for some. All right, so we have run the actual placement of the zones, so a few of them, not all of them, just a few of them. We've tagged all of them and also given them whatever names it is we want. So in this case, just given them basic naming based on what's going to be supplying those particular areas out there. In the future, by the way, in case you wanted to add items to the zone, like maybe with this open office, open support office sales area over here, maybe all of this is going to be a part of the same heating cooling zone. You can, of course, always come back with pretty much any element in Revit, edit that zone, add additional spaces to it, which will then automatically colorize based on that same zone, or remove spaces from it if you end up getting too many, and it will decolorize from that. But that way, again, you can visually validate what is associated specifically to each individual zone out here. Great way of being able to manage this and maintain your zones just by quickly visualizing what's going on out here in the floor plans. Now, for sake of time, I'm not going to fully zone out all of this portion of my building. I'm going to jump over into doing some quick preliminary heating and cooling loads over here. We're going to talk about two ways of doing this. So method number one, great kind of early quick analysis methodology, is directly internal to Revit, just native Revit, nothing special needed. As long as your room properties are set up, you'll get ballparked to the right area out here. So in the internal to Revit area here, you can leverage the analyze. Again, this is analyzing. The whole step today is all about analysis. You can do reports and schedules, and you can do the quick heating and cooling loads. And this actually runs pretty quickly. In fact, I'll do this right now just to make sure that it's done by the time I'm done talking about the external tools area here. But inside of Revit inherently, there's that Analyze tab over here, heating and cooling loads. Sorry, wrong button. Nope, that is the right button. It's going to generate a bit of the building sort of logically. I can go through the exercise here of modifying any of the extra general settings of the building, modify some of its details, and ultimately here, I'll click calculate once this is done. And of course, once I'm in a webinar, as per usual, Revit decides to take its usual 2-minute process and turn it into a little bit longer process. We're going to let that cook here for a minute while we talk about the rest here of this particular step. So that was the internal to Revit method. We'll come back to that here in just a moment once that model decides to load. But there's also the external tools option. If you want to do this externally, maybe you like using Trace or HAP or you name it, whatever analysis tool you want to leverage. The vast majority of these actually can take information in via GBXML, run some analysis internally in their environment, and then dump information back out that you can then re-import back to Revit. To do this, though, one of the better ways of doing this is to start by creating an energy model in the Revit space. You could also, I believe, leverage the spaces directly, but creating an energy model in Revit gives it a bit more fidelity when that data comes back into the model. You can then go to File, Export GBXML, exporting that analytical model. And then once you're done in that external tool, you can turn around and use the Import GBXML process here. Now, this takes you off the Analyze tab that we've been on all day. That's totally fine. It's just a method for you to get data out to the GBXML, run it through whatever analytical tool it is you need, and then turn around and import that back in. Over the years, Autodesk has moved a little bit where some of these GBXML import-export processes are. This is where it is in the Revit 2020 version, and I believe all the way through 24. I believe they're all pretty much the same now. It's stabilized a bit there. Take a look back in Revit over here, see if it's got what I wanted. Yep, it's pulled up the building. It's ready to go. I've got some details over here of my different spaces and the zones that they're associated to. I could go zone by zone and provide some modified information here, space by space, modify it here as well. Those space types that we've previously assigned, they're all ready to go. And you can also modify if you wanted to through here what those space types and building construction types and properties and thermal analysis, electrical loads, all the data about this, you can modify this information right through here as well. And so I could go ahead and just click calculate here, leveraging those spaces. Had I also leveraged that creative and energy model, I could be leveraging here the analytical surfaces. Since I didn't actually generate the analytical surfaces, that one won't actually do anything for me right now. But this is just going to run through and leverage the spaces themselves with their core properties, their core construction types, basic data, and get me some design information that I can begin with. Meanwhile, maybe I've also exported the GBXML file and the engineer is running their analysis. Maybe I'm sort of engineer in training out here, just getting some preliminary data. So I have some basic, something quick that I can work with, and it gives me some basic cooling, heating, airflow properties that I can begin some design criteria based on. This gives me a loads report. This loads report will be dumped underneath reports right here, reports, loads reports. This is an area that if you're building a brand new template yourself from the sample model, you want to make sure you do clean up the loads reports because there will otherwise be extra loads reports that you don't want inside of there. So in my case, this is the first one for my model since I had cleaned it up when I built my template. It's nice, neat, and clean there. The real reason I did this, though, wasn't to review this whole table here. It was more just to get some original preliminary heating airflow properties inside of here. So looking at these spaces now, if I was to go select any one of these spaces, this has my calculated supply airflow, just a preliminary value that I can design to. And then leveraging however I want my return airflow kind of calculated. It's either based on the specified property or the calculated supply airflow for return or whatever. And then it will leverage those values as I'm actually placing my supply terminals in these spaces and my actual return terminals in these spaces. It's going to be giving me some of that quick analysis based on this. In fact, let's take a look at that. One of the future schedules that you'll be leveraging takes this data that comes either from an external GBXML analytical cycle or directly from in the model, and it compares your design to it. Here in my design flyout, rather incorrect. Is that right? Design fly, nope, sorry, it's right here. Load calculations again. Space airflow summary. This space airflow summary right here will list out every single space. It will list out every one of these calculated supply airflow properties inside of here and some of my specified return airflows if I've specified that. And as I'm dropping in air terminals into each of these spaces, it will give me the actual design flow rate compared to the calculated rate from whatever the analysis was and give me a percentage difference. And then similarly here, the return airflows, exhaust airflows, give me some pressure checks inside of here, gives you some quick information that you can leverage while you're designing. This schedule is pre-baked into the MEP productivity pack, but it does rely on some kind of analysis having happened for these calculations to actually do something, since a lot of this is based on the calculated supply values or return values. So make sure you're leveraging those schedules, but to do that, you will have to have run some kind of analysis, whether it be in Revit or whether you're using an external tool, cycling it back into Revit so you can leverage some of that extra power while you're actually going through design. Again, the whole purpose of the MEP productivity pack as a whole is to save you time and to do some work for you. And as long as the numbers are there, it's doing work for you. It's running calculations. You can do, maths very easily in Revit schedules. So now let's talk about one final topic here before we kind of close out today. Final topic relates to outdoor airflow calculations. There's a couple of ways you can do this. But the one that I'm going to recommend here, so first off, let's talk about some previous workflows. The MEP 19.1.1 and all of the older versions of the MEP productivity pack, they had a whole bunch of schedules baked into the template that helped you with an ASHRAE Table 62.1 workflow. My template today, I don't have those schedules baked in. I believe I can obtain them from the sample model, but I don't have them. So what I've been leveraging here is just the built-in energy settings. If I modify those and set up my space types correctly, which are going to help me with my supply and return airflow calculations, I can also get my outdoor air calculations to work, which I think potentially makes this workflow a bit less relevant. Maybe not far less relevant, just a bit less relevant. So you don't have to have extra schedules and extra tools at play. You can absolutely still use the ASHRAE Table 62 one workflow documentation that's in our user guide, that's in our previous videos that we've done before. You can still leverage that, it's still valid. It's just I like using built-in stuff when I can. The big thing is that you need to make sure that your building and space properties really are set correctly. We talked about that earlier. Some of those air exchanges, some of those outdoor air infiltration properties in those space settings, if you have those set up correctly, when you're applying for your space type for your supply air calcs, it'll also give you a number of the calculations for your outdoor air as well. So then technically, it should automatically update with those outdoor airflow requirements, and we can kind of take a look at that real quick. If we were to go to any of these spaces here, like this office up here, this should have some outdoor airflow calculations already pre-baked in this case needing 10.65 CFM of outdoor air, given some of the air exchange rates that we've got that I put into that room. This number, if I had 0 air exchange rate, it would change a bit about how what the CFM supply air to the room actually is, but it would also change a bit of that outdoor airflow calcs. So you can tweak a lot of this by presetting these properties down here with the space type calculations. Now, of course, you're going to want to make sure you test all of what I said. Don't just blindly trust anything Sean says here as far as calculations go. You need to test it. But if you want to, you can always default back to those previous parameters that we have here baked into the MEP productivity pack. There's a bunch of these ASHRAE outdoor air properties here. If you modify these space by space, you can leverage the schedules again that exist in the sample model to fill a lot of these out and to run some other calculations. That also, though, requires proper occupancy on the room, some of which can come from modern calcs, but you might also need to leverage some workflows with Spreadsheet Link for that workflow to make that as efficient as possible. So if you have any questions about that, I'm going to encourage you to touch base with us on a different call outside of this webinar, just because we're rapidly running out of time. So let's cover where we're at here. Project startup, we've talked about all of these things here, the whole process to get us to the stage where we're actually beginning layout of HVAC, layout of electrical, layout of plumbing fixtures. We're beginning our design. We're kicking it off, and that's where you take over. You begin your actual design. Now, we're going to we are going to kind of quickly take a look at just a couple of design assist tools in the MEP productivity pack that you might care about. Just want to identify where they are. There's some floor plans and there's some schedules that you're going to want to focus on. So I'm going to give you some generalities here. In the schedules area, you want to look at anything that's grouped in an analysis grouping, a design grouping, or a load calculations grouping. One of those three. In fact, just a moment ago, while I was over here in Revit, I expanded out the HVAC design collection right here. These are some fantastic schedules for you to leverage to validate your design while you're laying out elements. Design schedules are incredibly powerful. Load calculations was the other one. These are some powerful schedules. Up in the electrical section up here, if I was to go into, I believe it's lighting, you'll see a grouping here for analysis. So analysis, design, and load calculations are the three major sections. They're grouped throughout a number of these different discipline collections here. Those schedules can really help you while you're going through the exercise of actually running your design. Focus on those, really powerful. There's also a number of others. There's coordination schedules to coordinate between disciplines. There's some general dimension settings. There's some general overall settings inside of here as well. General properties. I didn't mention this one, but this is just sort of overall design settings inside of here. So focus on those major sections when you're early in the design process. Later on, of course, you'll be focusing a lot on construction and permit schedules in each of these sections. But for now, those design schedules are really powerful. In the floor plans area, the two groupings that you're going to want to focus on the most is design analysis and design model. While you're running through your actual design, connecting ductwork, connecting pipework, laying out electrical devices and creating circuits, while you're going through those exercises, it's incredibly important that you leverage these views up here in the design model collection, especially the design model for the power floor plans, lighting ceiling plans. These views here have a lot of the analysis built directly in to help you understand circuitry. When we talk about the connectivity of ductwork, piping, and those types of items, you're going to probably want to be jumping into the design analysis views because there's a number of floor plans inside of here that are purpose-built to help you understand, do you have flow? What is the friction loss? What is the velocity? Similar deals here for the plumbing side. What are the fixture units, the fixture units, the velocity? Do I have proper connectivity? There's also some nice powerful lighting ones inside of here for doing some quick lighting analysis based on the properties you've set during this whole spaces phase. So make sure you're focusing on those views. Leverage these. These are really powerful. Don't just go to construction permit and begin doing all your work right there because it's our traditional workflow. Make sure you focus on these design analysis working views and the design model working views. These are purposefully built to help you out, and that's why we spent the time in View Creator to actually build them, because they give you information. They spoon feed you information while you're working and help make sure that you're able to make good design choices and coordinate your design as efficiently as possible. So with that, we're going to jump into a QA session here in just a moment, answer any questions that you may have posed in the questions window. If you have any questions, throw them in there now. But for those of you who don't hang out for the QA session, as always, we want to say thank you. We always appreciate when you show up live to our webinars. We feel that it makes it more interesting for you. We certainly hope it does. Certainly makes it more interesting for us when you interact with us, and we feel that it helps improve the content overall. We also, again, encourage you to go to YouTube and search out CTC Software for our channel, because this recording is going up there. And also pay attention to the ctcsoftware.com events page, because webinars like this are getting published all the time, and you can always participate with us live in those.